bit mad, but I still love the boys. I hope the best for them. But bro, I left because I needed more time for myself. If I'm being honest, yeah.
Was Sidemen actually taking that much time out of you?
Probably thinking like, shit, maybe I should go back. I am happy for the boys. Like, if anything, I feel like they're performing better without me.
Bro,
2 months ago, KSI made one of the biggest decisions of his career. He walked away from the Sidemen, not because the group was failing, not because they were running out of ideas. And according to KSI himself, not even because he stopped caring about the people he'd spent more than a decade building with. He said he needed more time for himself. But there was another part of the story that was impossible to ignore. KSI didn't just want freedom. He wanted to go bigger, he wanted to beat Speed, then he wanted to beat the Sidemen, and eventually he wanted to reach the top of YouTube. MrBeast, on paper it sounded like the beginning of KSI's biggest chapter yet, except there's one problem. The numbers haven't followed the plan. The Sidemen are still pulling millions without him. KSI's solo numbers are nowhere near where he said they would be. And then, after getting absolutely destroyed by the internet, KSI admitted something that makes this entire story even more interesting. He said there was a point where he genuinely thought, maybe I should go back. So what actually happened? Did KSI make the right decision and simply need more time? Or did he walk away from the very thing that made him successful in the first place? Because the more you look at what happened after he left, the harder that question becomes to answer. To understand why this became such a big deal, you have to understand what KSI was actually walking away from. The Sidemen weren't just another YouTube group. For years, they had built one of the strongest creator brands in the UK, and KSI wasn't some random member. He was one of the faces most closely associated with the entire thing. So when he announced that he was leaving, the obvious question wasn't, why would anyone leave a successful group? The real question was, what does KSI think is waiting for him on the other side? And his explanation, at least initially, sounded reasonable. He said he needed more time for himself. He talked about struggling to balance his personal life, family, businesses, and everything else happening around him. And honestly, that part is difficult to argue against. KSI has spent years doing an absurd number of things at the same time. YouTube, boxing, music, business, Prime, football, public appearances, and everything else that comes with being KSI. So if someone in that position says, I need to step back and take control of my life, that's not automatically suspicious. But the timing created a problem, because alongside the explanation about needing balance came a much more ambitious message. KSI didn't simply want less work. He wanted more control over what happened next. He wanted to go global. He wanted to prove that he could build something enormous on his own. And eventually, he openly talked about going after some of the biggest creators on the platform, Speed. And then MrBeast, that changes the story completely. Because now this isn't just KSI needed a break. It's KSI believes he can become bigger without the Sidemen. And that's a very different bet. And to be fair to KSI, there was a logic behind it. Imagine being part of a group where every major decision has to involve multiple people. Everyone has different goals, different schedules, different ambitions, different opinions about what the content should become. KSI himself described frustration with the group's structure. He wanted change, he wanted bigger ideas. He wanted the Sidemen to become a global entity, but not everyone necessarily wanted to move at the same speed. And if you're convinced that you're capable of building something much bigger, eventually you're going to ask yourself a simple question: why am I waiting for 6 other people? That mindset isn't necessarily wrong. In fact, it's probably part of what made KSI successful in the first place. He has never exactly been known for thinking small, but there's a massive difference between believing you can succeed alone and actually proving it. And that distinction became incredibly important after he left, because once KSI walked away, there was no more group to blame, no more voting system, no more 6 other people slowing down a decision, no more Sidemen structure. It was now completely on him. If KSI wanted to become one of the biggest creators on the planet, he had the freedom to do exactly that, and that's where the experiment really began. If KSI's theory was correct, you might expect something to happen after he left. The Sidemen should struggle. Their numbers should fall dramatically. Their content should lose something important. After all, if KSI really was carrying the group to the extent some people believed, removing him should have created a noticeable hole. And initially, there was some movement. But then something happened that made the entire situation much more complicated. The Sidemen recovered, and they kept going. In the competitors' supplied comparison, the last 3 Sidemen uploads were averaging around 4.37 million views, while KSI's last 3 uploads were averaging around 1.2 million. That's not a tiny difference, that's several times the audience. And suddenly the story wasn't, KSI left the Sidemen because they were holding him back. It became, what if the Sidemen weren't actually holding him back? Because the group continued existing, the chemistry continued, the audience continued watching. And perhaps most importantly, the brand didn't disappear when KSI walked out. That doesn't mean KSI wasn't important to the Sidemen. He clearly was. But it does challenge one particular assumption, that the group needed KSI more than KSI needed the group. And that's where this story starts getting uncomfortable. Because KSI wasn't simply trying to beat the Sidemen, he had already set his sights much higher. He talked about wanting to compete with speed, and eventually, MrBeast, that's an enormous target. MrBeast isn't just another YouTuber. He's operating on an entirely different scale, and KSI knew that. He even laid out the progression himself. First beat the Sidemen, then speed, then eventually Jimmy. It's an ambitious plan, but ambition creates a problem when you make the goal public, because now everyone gets to watch. Every upload becomes evidence, every view count becomes evidence, every month becomes evidence, and if the numbers go up, you look like a visionary, but if they don't, people start asking questions, and unfortunately for KSI, those questions arrived pretty quickly. Let's put the comparison into perspective. According to the figures presented in the supplied competitor material, KSI's recent uploads were averaging around 1-2 million views. The Sidemen were averaging approximately 4.37 million, and MrBeast's last 3 were around 67 million. That's roughly 4 times KSI for the Sidemen, and dozens of times larger for MrBeast. Now, obviously, one set of 3 videos doesn't determine someone's entire career. That's important. A creator can have a bad month. A creator can change strategy. A creator can experiment. One video can suddenly explode, so the argument isn't KSI is finished. That's lazy. The more interesting argument is KSI currently moving toward the goal he said he was chasing? And based on the supplied numbers, it's difficult to argue that he is, because his ambition went up, but his immediate performance didn't rise with it. And that's a dangerous combination. When expectations are low, 1 million views can be incredible. When you publicly announce you're coming for MrBeast, 1 million starts looking very different, and this is where KSI may have misunderstood the size of the challenge. Because competing with MrBeast isn't simply about having money, it's not simply about having a huge audience, it's not even simply about having personality. MrBeast has built an entire machine around YouTube. His content operation is designed around scale, testing, retention, packaging, production, global audiences, and most importantly, obsessive focus. Meanwhile, KSI has spent years dividing his attention across multiple industries, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. He's built businesses, he's boxed, he's made music, he's created brands. He's done things most creators will never come close to doing, but that creates a fundamental problem. If your goal is to become the biggest YouTube creator on earth, you are competing against someone whose entire operation is built around that exact objective. It's like trying to win a race against someone who spends every waking hour training. While you're also running 3 other races at the same time, you might be more talented, you might have more personality, you might even have more natural ability, but eventually, focus matters. And now we get to the part of this story that I think is far more interesting than the numbers. It's the contradiction, because KSI gave several explanations for his decision. He talked about needing balance. He talked about needing time for himself. He talked about wanting to focus on his own direction. All of that is understandable, but then the ambition came right behind it. He wanted to become bigger. He wanted to compete with speed. He wanted to compete with MrBeast. And suddenly the message became difficult to reconcile. You can't simultaneously say, I need to slow down and make more time for myself, and I'm going to chase the biggest creator on the planet. Those are 2 completely different lifestyles, and that's why people became skeptical, not necessarily because they believed KSI was lying, but because the 2 explanations don't naturally fit together. Maybe he genuinely needed more time. Maybe he genuinely wanted to become bigger. Both can be true, but if both are true, then leaving the Sidemen wasn't really an escape from pressure, it was a trade. He traded the pressure of working inside a group for the pressure of proving he could dominate alone, and judging by his own reaction to the backlash, that pressure hit hard. There was another promise KSI made that becomes interesting when you look at what happened afterward. He didn't want to simply become another copy of MrBeast. He talked about wanting to bring personality into massive-scale content. The idea was essentially, I can reach huge audiences without becoming a robot. That's a strong philosophy, and if he pulled it off, it could have been a genuinely interesting evolution. But then people started looking at the actual content and asking, where is the personality? Because huge challenges, retention hooks, and universal formats aren't necessarily personality-driven content. They can be. But the format itself doesn't automatically make them personal. And this is where the criticism becomes more nuanced. KSI didn't necessarily fail because he tried to make bigger videos. The problem is that his stated identity and his content strategy started moving in different directions. He wanted to prove, I can be different from MrBeast. But people increasingly saw he's using the same playbook, and once that comparison started, it became extremely difficult to escape, because MrBeast was the exact person KSI had publicly chosen as his benchmark. There's another thing people sometimes overlook. The Sidemen weren't successful just because they had big creators. They had chemistry. That sounds simple, but it isn't. Millions of people weren't watching just to see KSI. They were watching a group of personalities who had developed relationships with each other over years. The jokes, the arguments, the friendships. The personalities, the unpredictability, the feeling that you were watching a group of friends rather than a corporation, that was part of the product. And KSI leaving meant giving up access to that machine. He could absolutely build something new. But building something new is much harder than optimizing something that already works. That's the gamble he took. And maybe this is the most important question of the entire story. Was KSI actually being held back by the Sidemen? Or was the Sidemen giving KSI something he couldn't reproduce alone? Because those are very different things, and whatever KSI expected from the decision, he clearly wasn't prepared for the reaction. The backlash became enormous. People accused him of abandoning his friends. People accused him of chasing money. People accused him of trying to become MrBeast. People even started calling for boycotts. And suddenly the narrative wasn't, KSI is becoming bigger. It was, KSI abandoned the people who helped build him. Whether that criticism was fair or not almost became irrelevant. Because the internet had already decided what the story was. And once that happens, you have a serious reputation problem. KSI eventually acknowledged just how bad it got. He described going through different corners of the internet and seeing himself repeatedly getting destroyed. And then came the line that changed the entire story. He admitted there was a part of him thinking, maybe I should go back. Think about how significant that is, not a commentator, not a former Sidemen member, not a random viewer, KSI himself. Now he said it while laughing, so we shouldn't pretend this was a formal announcement that he wanted to rejoin the Sidemen. It wasn't, but that doesn't make the admission meaningless, because people usually don't joke about the exact thing they're completely certain about. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum, it came after the backlash, the comparisons, the disappointing numbers, the Sidemen continuing to perform, and KSI himself acknowledging that the reaction was far worse than he expected. Suddenly that joke carries a little more weight, because maybe the regret isn't, I should never have left. Maybe it's, I should have handled leaving differently. And that's an important distinction, because even if KSI still believes leaving was strategically correct, he can regret the way he did it, he can regret the timing. He can regret not communicating properly. He can regret underestimating how emotionally attached the audience was to the group, and he can regret assuming the audience would automatically follow him. Those are very different types of regret. This is where I think the story becomes much bigger than KSI. Because leaving the Sidemen wasn't necessarily a mistake. There are plenty of successful creators who eventually outgrow groups. Sometimes you need independence. Sometimes you need to take risks. Sometimes you need to walk away from something comfortable to find out what you're capable of. That's normal. The potential mistake was believing that leaving automatically meant becoming bigger. Those are not the same thing. The Sidemen were a platform. KSI was a personality, but the platform amplified the personality. Once he left, he had to replace that amplification himself, and that's much harder than it sounds. Because millions of people may recognize KSI, without necessarily wanting to watch every version of KSI. That's the difference between brand awareness and viewer loyalty. Let's be honest. Ego is obviously part of this story, but not necessarily in the simple way people think. Ego isn't always, I'm better than everyone. Sometimes ego is, I know I'm capable of more and I refuse to accept that this is my ceiling. And that can actually be a powerful trait. It's probably helped KSI enormously throughout his career. Without that mentality, he might never have become the person he is today. The problem begins when confidence becomes a prediction. KSI didn't just believe he could become bigger. He publicly mapped out the people he intended to surpass. Sidemen, Speed, MrBeast. Once you do that, you've created a scoreboard, and the internet loves nothing more than checking the scoreboard. And that's why the Sidemen numbers hurt more than the MrBeast comparison. MrBeast is an almost impossible target. Everyone understands that, but the Sidemen, that's the group KSI just left. If they had collapsed after he left, his argument would have looked much stronger. Instead, the group continued. And according to the supplied comparison, their recent average was substantially higher than KSI's. That's the kind of thing that makes people ask, who is actually holding whom back? Again, that doesn't prove KSI was useless to the Sidemen. He wasn't, but it does prove something much simpler. The Sidemen were bigger than one person, and perhaps KSI underestimated just how powerful the collective had become at this point. There are basically three possible futures. Scenario 1. KSI's current numbers are simply a temporary dip. He figures out the formula. The content improves, the audience catches up. And 6 months from now, everyone looks back at this period and laughs. If that happens, KSI wins the argument. Scenario 2, KSI continues experimenting. He doesn't reach MrBeast level numbers, but he builds a successful solo brand anyway. And honestly, that would still be a huge success, because you don't need to beat MrBeast to have an incredible career. Scenario 3, the solo strategy never reaches the level KSI expected. The Sidemen continue thriving. And eventually the public narrative becomes, KSI left the most valuable collaboration of his career chasing a goal he couldn't reach. That's the version he obviously doesn't want, but right now, it's too early to know which story we're watching. And that's why I don't think the real story is, KSI is finished. That's far too simple. KSI has already achieved more than most creators could dream of. He's built multiple businesses. He's competed in boxing. He's made music. He's helped create one of the biggest creator groups in the world. He's been at the center of UK internet culture for more than a decade. So this isn't a story about someone who suddenly became irrelevant. It's a story about someone who reached an enormous level of success and decided it still wasn't enough. He wanted to know if he could do something even bigger on his own, and there's nothing wrong with that. But now comes the difficult part. He has to prove it, because the Sidemen are still there, the audience is still watching. MrBeast is still miles ahead, and KSI himself has already admitted that at one point the backlash made him wonder whether he should go back. Maybe that was just a joke, maybe it wasn't, but either way there's a lesson here. Sometimes the thing you think is holding you back is actually the thing making you stronger, and sometimes leaving the group isn't the mistake. Thinking you were the only reason the group worked might be. So the real question isn't whether KSI regrets leaving the Sidemen. The real question is, will KSI eventually prove that he was right to leave? Because if he does, this entire period will eventually look like the beginning of his biggest transformation. But if he doesn't, then walking away from the Sidemen may end up being remembered as one of the biggest gambles of his career. And right now, the scoreboard is still being written. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think KSI made the right decision leaving the Sidemen? Or do you think he underestimated just how important that group was to his success? And if you want more deep dives into the biggest stories happening across the creator world, subscribe, because this story isn't over yet.